Their Stories Foundation presents Descendants, interviews with second and third generation survivors. Today's guest is Nicole Korsen. Nicole, tell us about your family's history and their story in the Holocaust.
A lot of what I know is from my Aunt Sabina, who just passed away a month ago, at 87. She recorded it for the Shoah Foundation. My dad did not. They have very different views on that, on sharing. Um, she also, not that there's anything wrong with it, but she took retribution money, and that's something my dad always refused to do because he kind of considered it blood money. But just it was my dad and his brother and sister, and the stories you get from the three of them were vastly different. Not vastly, but different enough. So it's
Right.
been a hard story to piece together.
Yeah.
But here's what I know. Here's what I know.
And what
So
was what was their age difference?
so when they went into this orphanage that I'll be telling you about, my dad was 4, my uncle was 5, and my aunt was 7.
Okay.
So, they were similar age and their experiences were similar. They differed a little bit, but for the most part, you would think they would be more in tune, but it's just interesting.
Yeah.
So, okay, so I'll start with my grandparents. My grandmother her name was Yetta. She was from Germany, and she was kind of described as like, dainty, artistic, that kind of thing. My grandfather was an Orthodox Jew from Poland, long white beard, very Orthodox. They
Wow.
were second cousins, which apparently was common at the time.
Sure.
So they got married, and in 1936 is when they moved to Belgium.
And what was their last name?
Their last name was Wagshaw.
Wagshaw. Okay.
Yeah, Wagschal.
And his first name?
His first name is Solomon,
Solomon. Okay.
and her first name was Yetta. Um, and when I look up, to find her maiden name was Treft. It says Treft or Nagel. I'm not sure what combination of that. So yeah, that was how I was able to find that. He was a furrier, and then when he came to Antwerp, in Antwerp, diamond cutting was the big industry, and so he became a diamond cutter. They were married. They had the 4 children. So they had, like I said, Sabina was the oldest, the girl, then Sammy, then my dad. They also had an infant named Israel, and he died before the war started.
Wow.
And when Sabina tells it, like on her show, I think they credit like Israel for helping save them, like he was looking out for them. And then after the war, even when they were telling them not to have more children, they did, and they had my Aunt Susie and Sarah, and she's the only one that to this day kept the Orthodox tradition, and she actually lives pretty close to me, and is in the same second generation group that I am.
And what's your dad's first name?
My dad's first name is Jack. It was Jacques, but when he, came to America, he Americanized it.
Yeah.
But when I tell a story, I kind of like to say Jacques because, I feel like that's his authentic self. That's really who he was.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, it was never very fun when I was taking French in school and, trying to speak to him in French because, he didn't learn it the same way everyone else did. He doesn't know the grammar. He just knew how to speak it. So I was
Right.
never saying it right.
Right.
So they lived in Belgium. They lived in Antwerp in the port city. That's where my grandfather was the diamond cutter. I went there once in the 90s, and my dad's directions were: you get off the train, you go left, you go right, you go down a few streets, there it is. And believe it or not, we found it. So
Wow.
it was pretty incredible to see that that's where they had lived. So they
Wow.
were, a typical Orthodox household. They were strict, they were kosher. My grandmother would bring, the food, the cholent, I guess, is not something we make today, but to the butcher on Friday nights and pick it up after Shabbat. So they were also, as I think they all described it, a loving family, but not like outwardly so. So, it was more, they knew it, but it wasn't shown. So what happened then is, as they were living in Antwerp, Antwerp was the first place in Belgium to become occupied. So they were kind of unprepared and surprised. And in 1942, they took Solomon. Um, Local collaborators had kind of taken over the diamond cutting industry, and the government supported them. And so first they took the Jews that weren't native of Belgium, and that was like 90% of the Jews that were living there at the time. And so my grandfather was taken. In Sabina's Shoah testimony, she talks about that night, and she remembers like the things. My dad never remembered anything about that, but she remembers the boots, and they came to the apartment building, and they took all the men that were living in that apartment building,
Wow.
put them on a truck, and then he was sent to a work camp. Um, and I'll kind of tell you a little bit more about him in a little bit. And then Yetta, since he was gone, that left my grandmother with three kids and no support. And they were very young kids. And my grandmother was sickly. She had these stomach ailments. And I don't know if then like Crohn's disease was a diagnosed illness, but she was not well. And so after about a year, they put her in the hospital.
Wow.
Well, and when they put her in the hospital, it wasn't like, okay, we're going to do this overnight surgery and you're done. It was a series of surgeries. In a way, it was a blessing in disguise because she missed all of the initial deportations because they had started taking the women at that point. But because she was in the hospital, she needed a place to put the kids. And they were not the only ones. The roundups in Antwerp had begun in 42. And so there were all these kids that were finding themselves without parents. Um, so what she found was this, they called it a home, and it was, how do I say this? They were like residential institutions, but they were called homes. And it was run by this group called my French accent is god awful horrible. So Association de Judes en Belgique, but it was a group that was set up by the Gestapo, by the German authorities. And they were in these homes, the children weren't really hidden because they were actually registered by the Gestapo,
Wow.
but they were cared for. And about 700 Jewish kids in Belgium were placed into these institutions.
Wow.
And overall, I just found this statistic as I was kind of preparing. 3 to 4 thousand Jewish children were hidden and survived in Belgium. Like that's kind of an amazing story.
Yeah.
And, other than Denmark, I don't know of any other, communities like that.
Do you know how they found out about this residential home?
They were making it well known, and the one that they went to was literally right down the street. So I think it was a very
So it was
so
like it
it
was
was
your grandmother, she was already in the hospital.
yes.
And then so maybe some neighbors,
They may have even told her in the hospital
right,
because they wanted people to know about this. The Germans even wanted people to know about this because it kind of seemed like they were not as, it limited resistance because it looked like they were taking care of these kids. And
right.
so that was their goal.
Yeah,
And there's no documentation as to why the Germans approved this, but if they kept them kind of unaware of the actual deportations that were happening, and they're like, oh, here, we're going to care for your children, then people wouldn't resist. And not only would the kids not resist, but the parents that were being deported were like, well, if they're holding our kids, they're going to reunite us. So, just one of the many fallacies that we're told.
right.
Um, so she's in the hospital. They're in this home. It was run by this woman. Her name was Rosie Rothschild. And it was, in Sabina's testimony, she just can't say enough about this woman. It was her job to literally, because the Gestapo knew they were there, when they needed to fill a transport, part of the agreement was she had to give the kids over. She had to hand the kids over, some of the kids. And so they would come with certain kids on a list, and she would have to hand them over. And that's just something I can't even imagine. But because of that, it was never like they were safe. They were not safe for a minute because they knew that people could be taken.
Do you know how many children were in her home specifically?
Well, there were only about, I think, 3 to 4 homes in the network. And so they say about 500, 700 went throughout the course of the war. I have pictures of from this book that I found that shows it probably about 150, I think, while they were there.
Wow.
Yeah, and it was run just like an orphanage. Like you see, they're dressed nicely, and she made them kosher meals. They tried to have class. She gave them little plots outside where they could like grow flowers. Like she tried to give them as the most normal life as they could. But then friends that they were making would be taken.
Did
So
you
it was
did you ever find anything about her doing research? Like, or is this just from your aunt?
No, she's well documented.
Document.
Not well documented. This story, I have to say, like, and I'll talk about this as the questions come up about how I learned about it. It's really not very well documented, and that's what makes it so difficult. The one book that I found is in French, and so I had to kind of have someone help me translate that. There's not a lot about her, but in every one where they talk about this, they talk about her.
Wow.
And it was first her and her husband, and then they deported her husband. And then after he was gone, they made her do this.
Wow.
So, and I have a picture of her too, which is amazing.
Wow.
So, and my dad, like, he would tell stories about what it was. When my dad told us about what happened to him, a lot of it was very scattered. He was young. So at this point, when they were in the homes, my dad was 4, my uncle was 5, Sabina was 7. Sabina took on the role of kind of caring for them and watching them. But so my dad's memories are kind of, it says I grew up so fast, but they're not linear. So he remembers certain things here and there. One story he told was how he would, when they got there, they said that everyone was really nice and friendly, but shoes were really important. And so you had to hide your shoes because if somebody stole your shoes, then you would have to make new shoes out of cardboard. And that would be really hard to hide with if you had to run away quickly because
Wow.
they didn't have access to that. So just little things like that he remembered. Um, so at this point, now the family is in 3 different locations. So my grandfather is at the work camp, my grandmother is in the hospital, and the siblings, my dad and his brother and sister, are in this home.
Do you know
Um,
the name of the work camp that he was in?
I do. Um, it was Camier, Camiers, Camier in northern France.
Hmm.
Um, and he so so kind of getting back to him for a minute before kind of going on with my dad. So it's unclear exactly how long he worked at that camp, but what we do know is one day he just walked out. And I have to assume that he had, disguised himself a little bit because he would stand out. He didn't appear Jewish without the beard. He passed through a couple of villages. He just walked out by himself. And somehow he found somebody connected with the French underground, the Mackay, and they helped him.
Wow.
And what they did, right? I mean, incredible.
Yeah.
And I knew him till I was 10, and so it was really hard for me when I was hearing this story to imagine him doing these things.
Right.
But he did. Um, they gave him a new name, so he went from Solomon to Jean-Pierre. They gave him a new job. He became a farmhand, a new home. He lived in the haystacks. He lived with the pigs on this farm but most importantly, and this is what saved him, they gave him a handicap. They told him, pretend that you are deaf and mute because otherwise your accent will give you away.
Wow.
And so he basically didn't speak for the rest of the war.
Oh my.
And he worked with this same guy, and it was the safest way not to reveal his identity, and it worked.
Wow.
So yeah, his story is pretty incredible. Um,
So cinematic.
right? Like you can picture it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, okay, then is Yetta, my grandmother. So she's in the hospital. And like I said, she avoided the initial transportations. At this point, she's 31. There were 32 other Jewish people in the hospital, and apparently somebody ratted them out and said that they were there. So she was there until June of 1944. So that's so close to making it. She was sent to Mechlin. Mechlin was a camp just outside of Antwerp, and it was a way station. So it was one of those camps where they kind of gathered people to wait for when they had enough people to make a transport, but their transports went to Auschwitz. So she was sent to Mechlin. They came and got her from her hospital bed. They came and got everybody, the remaining Jews. That transport was the very last transport out of Antwerp, and she was on that. She went to Mechlin. She was there for a few months, and then in August 1944, and I know this because during COVID, the Holocaust Museum gave us access to their researchers, and so I actually have her transport papers that show her going
Wow.
from the hospital to Mechlin and from Mechlin to Auschwitz. She's sent to Auschwitz. What when by the time I never had these conversations with her. They both died when I was 10. I was too young to ask the questions. But what Sabina says is that, and what my dad said too, is her story is that she got to Mengele and she was shaking. And because of her illness, her cheeks were very red. And so they kind of thought that that meant that they were healthy. If you ever seen the movies and they're like slapping their
Yeah, yeah,
cheeks,
yeah,
want to
yeah,
show that. So
yeah.
it kind of went the other way and they're like, oh, well, she's healthy. And so they sent her to that side. And something else I recently learned is that when she was there, this was also the time when all the Hungarian women were being sent to Auschwitz. So and they were sent with their whole families, but because my grandmother had three children that she knew were alive, these women helped her and they did everything they could to keep her alive. Because remember, she was really weak. She had left the hospital. She was,
Yeah.
from these surgeries.
And
And so,
I'm sure her stomach issues were still going on, you know.
yeah, oh, absolutely.
I bet that was had a lot of to do with anxiety and stress and,
Right. Yeah, the things that we all deal with now, but imagine that times, 100.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so it gives me comfort though to think about her there with these women like really looking after her and trying to help. I went to Auschwitz 2 summers ago and it was really hard. And when one of the questions I ended with was there was a discrepancy in their story because I thought she was liberated from Auschwitz. And I thought, being so sick, being so weak, how on earth did she do that? If she was liberated, when Auschwitz was liberated, was she on a death march? Like, how did she actually get out of there? And what I found was she actually was moved in December 1944. That's 1 month before the liberation of Auschwitz. And there was a new camp that they were building. It was called Libau, and it was a women's labor camp, and they were trying to just get women to work there. And so she worked in a tank factory there, and she was there until the end of the war, and that's where she was liberated from.
wow. And
So
how did you find that out?
I found this out because on her transfer papers, it
Oh,
said Auschwitz, and then underneath it had the name of another camp. I've had these papers for about 5 years, and I'm like, wait a minute. And I just, I'm so
just put it
overwhelmed with
together.
everything.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
put it together, and then I looked up Leave Out, and that's what it was.
Wow.
And it put everything in perspective because I'm like, I didn't understand it. I'm like, how could she have walked away? Like, yes, our story's a miracle. It's a story of survival, but really, realistically, and now I get it. And that's where I think luck just totally comes in there, right?
Yeah.
And why they chose her to go to the camp, I don't know. And maybe the Hungarian women had something to do with it. But um, so that was very eye-opening. So um she ended up getting liberated. She was my dad says I've heard 57 and I've heard 67 at the most pounds at liberation.
Oh my God.
And so she had to spend the next full year in a sanatorium, kind of regaining her, herself. So that was,
Where's the
yeah.
where was the sanitarium?
I that I don't know. I need to find that out. I think it was in France, maybe.
Right.
So I think I do have that somewhere. But um, I mean, we are not a petite family. And my brothers are both like 6'2", and my dad, we always think would have been way taller had his, growth not stunted, but he was a good 5'10". So imagining kind of, sturdy people, this woman being weighing that little. I don't know where she got her strength. I really don't.
That's amazing.
Um, so then back to my dad and his siblings. So while their parents are going through those things, and of course they have no idea. They do not know. They did come. Okay, well, I'll get there in a second, but they were always on alert, right? Oh, I talked about how what their life was like from there. Then they were coming to fill the trucks because of that transport of women that had left the hospital and gone to Mechlin. Mechlin was coming back through and they were going to fill the trucks with the kids. And that's when they scattered. And that's when Madame Rosie sent them to other houses and they ended up in different houses, but out in there were some out in the countryside. But what happened was she had to find hiding places and specifically for my dad and his siblings because she had, I guess they did know each other because she had promised my grandmother to keep them safe. And also, my dad had bright red hair. He was a Spitfire, and so he was going to be hard to hide. So she wasn't going to take any chances with him. And so when they came, they found a place for my uncle and they sent him with someone. I think he went with a priest and hid with this priest. This was while the Germans, they were coming back from Mechlin on their way to Auschwitz, stopping with plans to stop at that house to fill up the transport. And so she had to hide everybody really quickly. And so but she found, so she sent some away. And then with my dad and Sabina, she couldn't find a place because people were really putting their lives at risk by taking on some of these kids. And they
Yeah.
weren't coming for all the kids. They were coming for kids who they just needed certain numbers. Well, there was a transport list. And because my grandmother was going to be on the transport, that's why they would be coming for the Wagshaw children.
Wow.
So she finds a place for Sammy, cannot find a place for Sabina and my dad. And like I said, she's worried about that because he's very, he stands out. So she took them to a wooded area and she put them in the wooded area. And she said, you're going to have to live here and I will come find you. And, one of the things my dad does remember very clearly is that time in the woods. He says it was 3 weeks. I don't know if it was that long, but they lived off berries. They didn't know if it was what was poisonous, what wasn't. Sabina was there to help and take care of him, but it was a really hard time. And then somehow Madame Rothschild found them.
God.
When she found them, that's when she's like, we're not taking any more chances. And then they moved the whole operation out to the countryside in a place called it's Lasne. I'm sorry, I don't have a great French accent.
Do you know, were there other kids with them in the woods?
Um, that I don't know.
I
My
imagine so,
understanding
yeah.
was no,
Really?
but that has never been made clear to me. And I think that's something I still need to find out. And I'm not sure if I'll be able to. But yeah. And I think they may have been safer without being in a group. So
Yeah.
that could be why they were separated. But Sabina was
It's
she
unbelievable.
she was an adult, she was a 7-year-old adult.
Yeah.
and she just took on this mothering capability. And ironically, she ended up never having children herself, which is
Wow.
interesting. Yeah. Um, and it was the place in the countryside where they moved to later was near Waterloo. Um, and
So she came and got them and
mhm,
then moved them to this other place near
yes.
Waterloo. And was your other aunt there?
Uncle. Yeah. So there
Oh,
were
your
two,
uncle, right.
they were separated at this point. And so there was another house called Wezenbeek. And I think they went to this Wezenbeek first, and Sam was waiting for them at the one near Waterloo. And at Wezenbeek, Sabina tells how, and this is what I found in my research too, that the first day that they came back there, the staff and 58 children were arrested. So they had moved most everybody out to these houses. So they were arrested and they were sent to Malign, which was Mechlin, that's the other name for it, which was that way camp. Well, apparently, and this is, again, the Secretary of Queen Elizabeth of Brussels intervened, of Belgium intervened, and all 58 children and those staff members were returned. They were freed.
Wow.
And so that to me is just so incredible. I mean, and that woman is in Yad Vashem's Righteous Among Nations. So, but that's what Sabina remembers. She's like, we think we're safe, and we get to this house, and then they come and take more kids away. So they just never had any moment of feeling safe.
Yeah.
Um, So finally, in May of 1945, liberation came. Apparently, Yetta, my grandmother, as weak as she was, came for the kids, but they were afraid of her because she looked like a skeleton. My dad barely remembered her, and they had gotten so close to Madame Rosie Rothschild that it was hard.
Yeah.
And so I think the transition wasn't as smooth as it could have been. And then they went to a DP camp and they were reunited with Solomon. And my dad, of course, claims that he's the one that recognized him. I doubt that.
I wonder how Solomon found them.
So, well, the DP camps were based on city. So it was where you would come from,
Yeah,
not where you were
yeah, yeah.
not where you were during the war. And
So Solomon shows up not looking like himself,
yep. And
and
my dad says that he was the one to recognize him. And maybe it's true. I mean, I will say my dad had these like dazzling blue eyes, and so did my grandfather. And so there's, maybe, I don't know.
yeah, why not? Why not?
Why not,
Yeah.
But
I mean, out of all this stuff that happened,
right?
that's a believable one.
Yeah,
And
exactly. Exactly.
the
And,
story is just, it's just unbelievable. It's just, I mean, you mentioned luck, but there's so much going on. There's so much.
and it's a
And
story
then,
of survival, which is so unusual. And I never realized how lucky we were until much later,
yeah.
you know.
We interviewed a gentleman the other day, and I mentioned to you he was 98 and a half years old, and he's like, I have no idea why I'm here. I have no idea why I survived. And he said, I guess it's just luck.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, there's a lot of, in your family's story, there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of people who are risking their lives. And
And I think there's a lot of strength too on their part,
of course,
and,
yeah.
and risk taking and a lot of that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And so, how long were they in that DP camp?
Um, I Not long, and then they were returned to their house in Antwerp,
Wow.
and next to their house was a Takamone, which was the school. And apparently they were housing some German soldiers there, some Nazis. And this story is one that, and when you grow up with it, when your dad's a survivor, he tells you things, but I was the only girl, I was the youngest girl. There's some things he didn't tell me. And he had told this one to my ex-husband that, so when they got back, my dad's like 8 years old
So
and
they're back in their family home.
back in their, yeah, yeah. Well, maybe, yeah, yeah. I think, so there's a different address. So I think they were maybe in a different house, but it was in the same area.
Right. Okay. So
So
maybe
they were, I think it was a different house because I have two different street names.
sure.
Um, and I guess these soldiers were next door and they would come out. And what the kids would do, what they realized is if the soldiers did anything out of line, they were going to be shot. And so the kids would throw rocks at the soldiers to try and get them to like retaliate to the kids. And the kids knew that if they were out of line, that they might get killed. And
Wow.
so these kids, these like elementary age kids are instigating. So, I mean,
That's
I just,
great.
right? I know, kind of, yeah.
That's great. Oh man,
So, yeah.
good for them.
hmm
Wow.
So, yeah, but and then they were going to go to Israel, and my grandfather did go, and he brought my dad actually, and um they went there, and I guess there was no diamond cutting industry. They just didn't, it just wasn't going to work. Some of
Oh,
our relatives did end up there,
okay. So
but
your dad and Solomon went to Israel to kind of check it out to see if
yes. But not right away. Like it was a couple of years. Like my dad must have been probably like, because when he came here, he was 15. So by then he was probably like 12 or something. So they stayed in Belgium initially, and then they looked for somewhere to go.
right.
Israel wasn't going to work. But like I said, they went and tried. And
Yeah.
then they came back and they had papers to move to Canada. And they had papers already in for the United States, but they were taking a long time. America was not overly welcoming right after. And so um, they had the papers for Canada and it came through and they were getting ready to go. And then my Aunt Sabina got an eye infection. And so they couldn't leave. And so they had to wait for the eye infection to clear. And by the time it cleared, the papers for the United States had come through.
Oh wow.
And so they ended up here. They ended up, their first place they were sent was to Detroit, and they lived in Detroit. And
Wow.
then they ended up going, of course, to New York, and the rest
What
is
year,
history.
what year did they get to New York?
It was, I believe, I have their flight. And I mean, it was amazing the materials that they were able to find. I have their flight manifest.
Wow.
But I believe it was probably like um 50, mid 50s.
Mid 50s, right.
Yeah, yeah. Um, So, yeah, so I mean, my dad never had an education. He never had, he didn't obviously graduate high school. We joke that he learned his English from watching movies, and he kind of did sound a little bit like Humphrey Bogart.
So
So,
by the time they got to New York, he was late teen, early 20s or something.
yes. Well, yeah, because he was in Detroit for a while. I know he said he worked at the JCC there, and there was some anti-Semitism going on, and it wasn't easy. And then
Yeah,
by the time he got to New York, he was in his late teens.
teens, yeah.
And then when he, yeah, and then I think he was in his early 20s when he met my mom.
And did he ever get an education?
No, he never did. That's why education was so important to him. I mean, that was it. Like it wasn't even an option for any of us.
Did Solomon go into the diamond cutting business?
Yes. He did. He did. And I remember visiting them a couple of times, but it was hard with their accents. And
Where did
so
they live?
they lived in I want to say Williamsburg. Is that right? Whatever the Orthodox Jewish area
Yeah,
was, that was
yeah,
very, very,
Williamsburg, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then my mom was in Brooklyn, and and this is a total aside, but Sabina again is the reason that they met. She has a lot to do with all of this because she was sitting at Coney Island wearing a zebra striped bikini with a bunch of French guys. And my mom walked by. My mom was wearing the same bathing suit. And so Sabina called her over. They start talking, they become friends. And Sabina waits 3 years until she decides my mom is good enough to introduce to my dad. And then she finally introduces them and they get married.
Wow.
And because my mom was conservative, not Orthodox, they had to elope first.
Oh,
And
wow.
so they eloped, and then 3 days later, they came back and they had organized a wedding.
So did you what religion what did you grow up conservative or
Yes,
yeah.
conservative. Hmm.
And how old were you when you heard this story?
So I
When you first
was,
heard the story?
I can almost tell you the date that I heard it because um, I was watching, it was 1977. And the reason I know this is because we were watching, do you remember the miniseries Roots?
Of course.
And, and back then, everybody, I mean, the entire country was watching it. There was no recording it. You just all watched it
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
And I remember it really affected me. And I was really upset by it. And, I had a very good friend at school who was Black. And I went to my mom afterwards. I remember I followed her into the bedroom. My dad was still in the family room. And I said, God, I don't know if Angie was watching this. And this was so upsetting. And how could this be? She goes, well, I said, but we would have been okay, right? Because, we're not Black. And she's like, well, there's this other thing that happened to Jewish people, to your father. And she didn't tell me much more that night. But what I do remember, she gave me some details and just told me big picture. And I went into my room and I remember worrying the entire night. I stood kind of cowering under my covers, looking up at the ceiling vent, thinking that gas was going to start coming out.
Oh my God.
And that's my earliest memory of knowing what the Holocaust was.
And that was just from her telling you about it.
Mhm. Yeah. I think from whatever she told me, that's what I pulled from it.
Yeah.
So that was when I first heard about it. And
So
after that,
it really, really affected you.
it really affected me. And, I to this day, it's always been the thing that I kind of feel like it's my responsibility. And from that day forward, I was like, I can't just hear this story. I have to do something with it. And I have to do something about it because it that's the only way I knew to pay tribute to the legacy of everything that they went through and everyone that didn't survive. And so the first thing that I did is I presented it to my Hebrew school class. And I remember doing that like in third grade when I had just learned about it. And I think from that moment on, I knew that like this was a story I was going to continue to tell in some way or another for the rest of my life. And I have.
Wow.
Um, and it's changed because, I've learned bits and pieces here and there.
Yeah, you put it together.
Yeah. Um,
And
and I knew that,
really, you've really done a remarkable job putting it together. I mean, I picture every moment of it, and I can see them there, up, people, the different places they went, and I can imagine the whole thing. So it's
well,
really
and,
quite.
when I was young, I thought they said orphanage. I thought, well, it couldn't have been by someone Jewish. So my whole life, I thought up until I was like 25, I thought it was like nuns. I'm like, oh, my dad was hidden by a group of nuns, and that wasn't the case. And
Right.
then randomly, I met this guy who I was doing a focus group at my job. And I said, oh, tell us something interesting about yourselves. And he's like, oh, my dad was hidden in an orphanage in Belgium during the war. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? And
Are you kidding me?
no. And so I mean, I could not even believe this. And so we started talking, and he was just about my age. And his dad, actually, I have this here. His dad had written a book in French. His dad um, was living in Israel at the time, but he had written this book. And this was the first time ever I had seen my dad's story in print. And it had pictures of him at the orphanage, and it had the manifest of the days they went in. And at that moment, it became as real as it had ever been. So
What,
we went to dinner, and my dad and he met, and they kept in touch. It was really amazing.
when was that?
This was I was in my mid 20s, so it had to be late 90s. So
Did
and
you? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna say everything when I've like I said, very little to be found on it, but everything I find on it, his dad's name is attached to it. Like he really took it upon himself to do the research. So again, look, the fact that I found this guy in such a random way was very
That's amazing.
bizarre.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did your dad? Did you notice trauma in your dad growing up? Was there anything
Um,
you can see that was, related to what he went through?
so, I think that we would never really make the connections until hindsight, now looking back, like, oh, okay. He he had, again, I told you the bright red hair, and red-haired people are kind of known to have a temper, but his temper was usually at bay. But when it wasn't, it was really scary
Mm.
and really scary. And it's kind of like an intermittent kind of thing. And so you just didn't want to upset him. And
Right.
so, but we didn't connect it then. And if I think about it now, I think about what made him upset, the things that his triggers were make a lot of sense. I remember one time the angriest he ever got at me was when I came home when I had a boyfriend in high school, and I was wearing a sweatshirt. We had gotten matching sweatshirts, and mine said property of John. And he was like, you are nobody's property. And the explosion that happened was really scary.
Wow.
So I think that that pent up rage was one thing. Another thing is food. He, um, he we would all have our salad bowls. His would be like four times the size. You had to eat everything on your plate. Food was very, very important, very important. And that's, we all have different relationships with food, but I think, that's something that is passed on, to the rest of us as well. I think all of us, me and my brothers, and even all of our kids kind of struggle with weight issues. And I think a lot of it is I don't know. I don't know if that's generational trauma or how we're dealing with it, but I there's food, I feel like an obligation to finish it because
I,
that's what
I
he had taught
understand.
us,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. I mean, my father went through the depression and it was the same kind of thing, like, you know, just you had to finish everything on your plate and, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I think there's something to do with passed down trauma, generational trauma, you know.
yeah. So, I mean, those were like the two main things. I do remember one time we were at Busch Gardens, and he do you know, but oh, you probably don't know. Do you know Busch Gardens? Do you guys have that? It's like an amusement park.
Yeah, I know what it is. Yeah.
And they have the different areas, and each area has like a different country. And I was young. I mean, it was after I knew what it was, but we walked by Germany, and he had a visceral reaction, and we had to leave
Oh,
because
wow.
he heard the music.
Wow.
So it was different things like that that were certain triggers for him.
Yeah.
And certain foods he wouldn't eat. He wouldn't eat peanut butter because that was something that, was a government surplus thing that they had had there. And so,
Did he have a happy life? Did he? Do you think he was?
Absolutely, 100%. And I mean, even though he didn't have a college education, he didn't have a high school education, he was a very, very, very hard worker. And, he had that strength. He had that strength that he had to have.
What
And
did he
he
do
ended
for a
up,
living?
he was, he worked for, there was an, well, first, his first job was in the garment center in New York. And, just little brag on my dad. They called him the scarf because he was so well dressed, which is funny because later in life he was not. But he and then he moved down here to work at an appliance store called George's, and he worked there for like 20 years. Then he ended up opening his own store. He opened up his own mattress store.
Good for him.
So he really was a success, but it was all because of his hard work. He made things happen. It
Yeah.
wasn't, nothing was handed to him. And so I think that he really did instill that in all of us as well.
And how you said you were 10 when Yetta and Solomon passed
Hmm.
away?
Hmm.
Did they pass away in Brooklyn? Did they live?
In, I guess, Williamsburg,
Yeah.
or yes, yes. Within a year of each other. I remember getting the phone call. Yeah. My grandmother was on dialysis, and then she died first, and then he died within a year.
Um,
So, um, yeah, and my dad, he kept relationships with his siblings. One ended up going to California, and Uncle Sam, I think his way of dealing with it was really not to talk about it as much. And then my Aunt Sabina, ended up being more, it was more of who she was to share her story. But in my dad's eyes, she made it too dramatic. And Aunt Sabina is a whole different story. She's fascinating. She ended up Orthodox Jewish family, right? She ended up marrying in New York a black calypso singer from the island of Tortola, Tony St. Thomas.
oh, how unbelievable.
And my dad, this is what is so hard was hard growing up. My dad had disowned her for that for about 15 years and
Right.
then came to his senses and didn't. And so growing up, it was hard to rationalize how can you do that against someone else when other people are persecuting against you?
Right.
But
Yeah.
it's you just can't explain it. But he came around, and then she was a part of our lives as well.
Wow. That is so interesting. And where did you grow up?
Silver Spring, Maryland.
And did
So
you,
they came down here. They came to DC when I was before I was born. So I think when my older brother was like 2. So most of their lives were here.
and did you grow up, and you said you grew up conservative Jewish, and
Mhm.
did you ever experience any anti-Semitism yourself?
So I grew up in Montgomery County, which is a pretty Jewish county in Maryland. Now I live across the river in Northern Virginia, and it's an entirely different scene altogether. But I mean, there were things. My mom had to take me out of brownies because they wouldn't celebrate Hanukkah. Um, I had a boy break up with me because I was Jewish, but nothing. Oh, yeah. There was the girl who I don't know if this was why, but on the school bus one day coming home in ninth grade, I had my hair in a braid, and my she lit part of the braid on fire. And I always thought it was because she was in my gym class and she didn't like that I had the end locker and she didn't. But now that I look back at it, I wonder if there was maybe more to it.
Mm.
But I don't know that to be true. So
Right.
I feel like, I went to Jewish summer camp. Like I was surrounded by Jewish people growing up. So I did not feel, if anything, I just felt more left out of the things that we couldn't do because we're Jewish. But I really don't feel like I witnessed any outward anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
I think that it's more rampant now. Um,
Yeah.
or at least,
It seems like it's more out in the open. And
yeah.
making itself know, it's making itself appear in very ugly ways.
Well, and in Montgomery County, like we would get Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur off, and that was, religion was very, very important to my dad. And I think, some people come out of it like Elie Wiesel, not believing in God anymore at all. To my dad, it was important. And um, we had, but in Montgomery County, you had 2 days off for Rosh Hashanah and one for Yom Kippur, just automatically. It was just how I grew up. And then here I am in Loudoun County, Virginia, and we just fought to get Yom Kippur as a day off. And now I have to go speak in front of the school board in 2 weeks because now they want to take it back away.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So in addition to the other, because we have a lot of, we have Diwali and we have Lunar New Year,
Yeah.
they want to take them all away.
Wow.
So yeah, I think it's really just a matter of exclusion more than anything. And I think the thing that bothers me the most is that Jewish kids now are afraid to even show that they're Jewish. I see this in my school. I run the Jewish Student Union, and kids don't want to be associated. They don't want people to know. My son in college, he had a big high necklace, and slowly it went under his shirt. Then all of a sudden it came
This,
off.
this is post October 7th.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It's a real shame.
yeah.
It's very frustrating. Um, I think it's wonderful how that you've done this research and continued to tell this story. And it's amazing story, and I've heard a lot of them, and it's a really, really incredible story. You this is obvious, but you seem like you have a sense of pride in carrying on this story and telling the story and being a second and third generation survivor yourself. Um, is that something that you sort of, take on as pride?
Yeah, and pride is such an interesting word because it's kind of like a balance because you don't want to say you're proud of that, but I am proud of my family and I'm proud of what they did and I'm proud of, um, so yes, it is. But it's also a responsibility. And it's one that I will feel until the day I die. That um, if I see things and I see people doing things, I'm like, I need to do more. I need to, it's hard because I feel like I've got this amazing story of survival and I want everyone to know it and I want it to connect. And I'm like, look, this is what can happen. And so, yeah, I think it is like part of how I define myself. Um, other than being a mom, being a wife, I think that it is probably my primary identity factor. And one thing I find myself doing is I don't know why I do this. Well, I kind of know why I do it, but I let it slip very early that I'm Jewish. And I think that's more fear of anti-Semitism or fear of somebody not understanding. Um, and so it's kind of like how I define myself. And then we started doing this equity work in our county, a couple of years ago, and I was the equity lead, and it was like it came up that I was white. And that's not an identity factor that I had really ever given to myself. It's kind of that weird, like, and the problem is, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but when you talk about, equity and everything, sometimes being Jewish doesn't count in that conversation. It's not really a part of it because it's not something that is visible from the outside. And
Hmm.
so I feel like I've been an
Right.
ally always for others. And I think that's been a hard thing lately is that, we need allies too.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I think that but I will say on the other hand, by telling the story, I had run this program called Adopt a Survivor at my school when my dad was still alive. And for 3 years, I gathered 4 or 5 local survivors and brought them together with small groups of 30 students at my school. And they all listened to their stories, but the catch was that they had to adopt them. And we gave them a candle. And by adopting them, all they were promising to do was to tell their story on the remembrance days. And just so that their names got told and their stories got told.
Wow.
And so when I see the way people react to that, and when I see the way people do react to my family story, that does give me hope. I feel like we are being heard, and yeah, I don't know.
Well, thank you so much. This has been an incredible interview. I really appreciate you sharing in such a honest and thoughtful way, and it's truly a remarkable story. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you for helping me tell it. I mean, that's worth its weight in gold.
Yeah, and is there anything anything else you'd like to add? Anybody who might be watching this, and
Um, Maybe just a little bit about what my dad would say at the end of his presentations to students. We touched on the idea of education. That's a really important thing. We talked about he liked to say just respect, respect of each other, respect of people's differences. He used to say, respect your parents, respect your teachers. Um, but also just like being aware of your surroundings and being kind of able to stand up when you see that something is wrong, even though it's hard, because it is hard. But even, I guess the one thing I would want to leave people with is that even if you try and you do something, something is better than nothing, because apathy is what kind of, is the problem. The Holocaust didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen. People didn't go from being these normal citizens into these evil Nazi soldiers in one day. It took time and it took cooperation from a lot of different people. And I think that to just be proud of your identity, be proud of who you are, and stand up for it. So I think that's it.
great advice. Great advice from your dad.
Yep, yep. He liked to give advice.
So let's say his name out loud.
Jack Wagshaw.
Jack or Jacques.
Jacques. Jacques. They would
Well,
call him Jacques.
thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, thank you so much, John. I appreciate it.